Welcome everyone. My name is Qingxin Lin. I'm current chair for B-MEIS, which stands for Bilingual Multilingual Intersection. It's a TESOL International Intersection. Nowadays, we use so many acronyms. Sometimes things got lost in translation. That's why I try to spell it out. Welcome to our session today. The title for our session is Designing for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Exploring Alternative Curriculum Models in Bilingual Education and Beyond. Before we proceed further, I would like to introduce our intersection a little bit. For those people who are not familiar with our intersection. Our intersection is created to support multilingual learners' academic success and support each learner's right and opportunity to become multilingual learners. We believe that bilingual education should be additive and dynamic. In other words, we want to go beyond the notion of bilingualism as equivalent to true monolingualism. We want the bilingual education to be able to capture the dynamics for learners' bicultural experience. So to support the above mission, we create this monthly webinar series. Webinar series is created is dedicated to reimaging bilingual and multicultural education in the era of changing linguistic landscape. Today's webinar is operated on two premises. On the one hand, we recognize today's nuance and complex reality of multilingual reality. On the other hand, we also want to address the coexistence of the increasing dominance of English as a form of monolingual in the today's language landscape. So at today's panel, we will explore, array of perspective, experience, and strategy about leveraging campus diversity to foster intercultural understanding and multicultural and multilingual awareness. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our 5 speakers today. They are Professor Keith Graham from National Taiwan Normal University, Professor Zozen from Islami from Texas A&M University, and Professor Christina Zaccarini from Adelphi University, and Professor Kathleen Richards from Indiana University and Pennsylvania, and Professor Zeynep Harkness from University of North Alabama. Now we will start with Professor Keith Graham.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Lin, for putting this wonderful webinar together. So today, since we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'm going to be talking about it from the language policy perspective, kind of along the lines of the goals of this group, in that we're going to be talking about some of the dominant narratives that may be preventing bilingualism or multilingualism in English medium instruction. To give you a little background about, before I joined academia, I was teaching primary and secondary school in Taiwan. And in English medium instruction schools where we taught content through English. And in all of the different schools that I've taught in, the rules were the same. I was only allowed to speak English, and my students were only allowed to speak English. Even though I'm bilingual in both Chinese and English, and my students were also bilingual, we weren't allowed to utilize our bilingualism in the classroom. And part of the reason is because of the dominant narratives that I will bring up today. And while many of you in this webinar may not buy into these narratives, I think it's important that we raise our awareness about them, because many of our colleagues are driven by these narratives, and also many of our schools. So the first narrative on the next slide is English medium instruction means English only. Great. And so, like I said, the schools that I worked in felt that our English medium instruction classrooms should only be English. But what is the definition of English medium instruction? Maccaro gives this definition. EMI is the use of the English language to teach academic subjects other than English itself. And with this definition, Maccaro in his book asks 3 questions. How much use, what kind of use, and used by whom? And in my school, they took a principle, what I'll call a principled approach, in saying that there are rules for each of these questions. How much use? English only. What kind of use? English in everything you do. And used by whom? Everyone. But that was not necessarily the most effective thing for the students that I taught. And so rather than taking a principled approach to English medium instruction like the school took in terms of the rules that they created, I took what we'll call an ethical caring approach. And what ethical caring is that all of my ethics are not necessarily based on rules that are created for these systems, but they're solely based on what my students need. And so when I was thinking about these questions, how much use, it wasn't English only because that was what the rule is. It was how much use of English and other languages do my students need, whether that be academically, socially, or otherwise. And what kind of use? Well, if there were activities where the students needed to utilize all of their linguistic skills at one time, then that's what we did. And used by whom? If they needed me to use it, I would. And if they needed to use it, I would allow them to, because all of our policies in my classroom were based on ethical caring. So on the next slide, I will talk about the second narrative. The second narrative is EMI students do not want other languages in the classroom. And if many of you may be teaching in primary and secondary schools, so we could substitute students for parents. Maybe we've heard that our parents don't want other languages in the classroom. They only want English only. And this dominant narrative kind of drives the first one of why some people believe English medium instruction should only be English. And it's prevalent throughout our school systems. In one study conducted by me, Dr. Islami, and our colleague, Dr. Hillman, we asked instructors in Qatar about their thoughts about using multiple languages, specifically Arabic and English, in the EMI classroom. And one instructor said, what you see on your screen, that this is an American university. The students came here, they know it's all in English, and that's what they expect. And so when we talk about the difference between the principled approach and the ethical caring approach, this instructor, because it's an American university, believes that it should be English only. But interestingly, in a follow-up study where we talked to the students, they told us something different. One student told us, Arabic can help. It can help us understand the concepts in the classroom. It can help us understand definitions easier. And so this dominant narrative isn't necessarily true. And I really loved what one student said, particularly as we talk about this idea of ethical caring. It doesn't matter what language is used if the point can be reached. So while there may be some rules about EMI being English only, sometimes what our students need to best understand the concepts are other languages. And so rather than taking a principled approach and allowing this dominant narrative to drive our classroom, we can take an ethical caring approach and be more inclusive of the languages we allow in EMI. Which brings me to the third narrative, that languages other than English shouldn't be used with non-native speakers. If we could get that slide back, the previous slide. There we go, thank you. Yes. Once again, this is a dominant narrative that is not only something we see in the English medium instruction classroom, but we see it throughout society. This idea that certain spaces can only have certain languages. And what's interesting about this narrative, like the last narrative, in our study, we found an instructor saying just this: I wouldn't use Arabic if my audience had one non-Arabic speaker. I don't want to make them feel uncomfortable. And as we talk about this idea of ethical caring, you might think to yourself, well, this professor is thinking about their student, thinking about them and caring for them, not wanting to make them feel uncomfortable. But then there's another way to look at this, especially as our world becomes more globalized, more diversified. Is pushing out languages really what's in the best interest of our students? Or alternatively, should we prepare them for these diverse settings? One student we asked, an international student that does not speak Arabic, talked about how he feels comfortable, he or she feels comfortable in these diverse settings with these languages. And rather than saying in the EMI classroom, we shouldn't allow any other languages because non-speakers may be present, maybe what we should be doing is promoting a more global mindset, a mindset that's more inclusive of the various languages that'll be around them in the world. And helping them, rather than pushing out a language to help them feel more comfortable, perhaps we should help them manage that discomfort so that later in life, they feel comfortable in those diverse settings. And so just some final thoughts. The quotes that I chose were admittedly purposefully selective to make the point about these dominant narratives that often drive decisions our colleagues make, decisions our schools make, and maybe even some of the decisions that we make. But I do want to be upfront and say that in our survey of instructors and students, there were a variety of opinions in this regard. However, what is clear is that there is a desire and need for languages other than English in the EMI classroom. And while I can't give you any answers about how much use of other languages, what kind of use, or by whom, because to be frank, the literature doesn't necessarily have rules of thumb. If you approach your classroom from an ethical caring perspective, you will know the answers because you will put the needs of your students first, and that will guide everything that you do. And on that, I would like to pass it off to Dr. Islami.
Okay, well, thank you so much to Dr. Lin for organizing this webinar. And thank you to our audience from all over the world. I can see different countries, participants from different countries. So it's great to be able to share these moments and talk about using multiple languages and resources and linguistic repertoire, especially during such a difficult time we are facing with COVID crisis. So what I am going to do is I am going to follow Dr. Graham's kind of a more theoretical presentation of what EMI is and students and professors' perspective. and ethics of caring, which is caring for the students, and provide you some examples of how I myself have implemented this translingual pedagogy, going beyond one language in one of my content classes, and also provide some other examples from other scholars. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Who's controlling the slides? Okay. So first I'd like to provide a definition of translanguaging based on Garcia and Way 2014. They say it is a dynamic process where multilingual language users, which is the majority in today's world, monolingual is not the norm anymore. They mediate complex social and cognitive activities through strategic employment. So it's not a wishy-washy, chaotic mixing and deficient perspective we are talking about. It's a strategic choice that language users, multilingual speakers, basically use their multiple semiotic resources to act and to know and to be. So identity is involved also. So if you go to the next slide, please. So in order to position the work of translanguaging pedagogy that we are discussing, and we have brought it up in some of our publications, Delheim's sociocultural perspective, which is language in use in every social context, so the reality of using languages. Edward Steed talks about culture and imperialism, and considering Western languages and cultures as civilized and others as primitive and backward. Jim Cummins talks about common underlying proficiency, meaning that languages are not separate entities in our heads. And Scott Kangas talks about language rights, which is definitely related to ethics and ethics of caring. Paulo Freire talks about pedagogies that are aligned with families and communities. And Gilbourne talks about critical race theory, which is basically not marginalizing one group of people and their language because of their race or because of their accent or because of the variety of language they use. And Ophelia Garcia, of course, has been a pioneer in promoting translingual pedagogy. So these kind of informed collectivity of different theories is the base of what we are discussing in the following slides. Next, please. Next slide, Dr. Lee. Okay. So if we can go to the next slide. I don't know who has the control on the slide. Can we get the next slide? Can you hear me? Somebody say you can hear me or not.
Yes, is this the slide you want? Or the next one? Is this? Dr. Islami?
Chin, I think he got disconnected.
Okay.
So you think you can move to maybe the next presenter while she comes back?
Yes. Okay. So the next speaker is Professor Christina Zaccarini.
Hi, yes, I'm here. Is Dr. Islami still gone?
Okay, so I'll begin by, I guess I'll start then and then she can continue after I finish. Okay, so I am a history professor, so I'm approaching this topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion from the humanities perspective. And this came to be because Professor Lin came to my classroom and suggested to collaborate with me and bring her students who are learning English into my history class. And as a result of that collaboration, my teaching in history has been enriched, and I've been told that the experiences of the international students have also been very positive as a result of this collaboration. So I'd like to talk about actually what Dr. Islami had mentioned about Edward Said and the concept of the West as civilized and other areas as uncivilized as a point of departure, and also how what Professor Graham had been talking about, how we can use language to open up dialogue and understanding of concepts rather than sticking just with English, using the language as a point of departure. And also, as he mentioned, ethical caring in the sense that in doing this, the international students become teachers in the classroom using English. We also look at the Chinese language, we look at logograms. So I introduce my US-based students to logograms, Chinese logograms. I'm not an expert in these thousands of characters, but when they are introduced to my class, which is comprised of US-based students and international students who visit, you know, and we organize these visits, then the international students who use logograms can elaborate on the meaning of these logograms and the culture and historical nuance that these represent. They're more familiar with the logograms, and logograms are, of course, a written character representing a word. And I can use the explanations and experiences of the international students who are conveying these in English as an entry point for examining nuances in history and culture. And that helped to dispel this narrative of the antithetical other. So I have a quote at the end of this that will show how this impacted one student. So again, yeah, next slide is good, Professor Lin. So these are just understandings of concepts that I taught. I chose 3. Foot binding. Now you can see the different characters that have represented foot binding. All of these mean to wrap and bind together or wind around, and all mean foot. They also, from the perspective of students, students can talk about how their family members had bound feet, what the experiences were, and they discuss this in English. And even when we went online, they used the chat box to talk about this in English. And so the international students were able to convey, you know, their experiences. They also say that foot binding means beauty. Now, if we contrast this to the Western perspective of foot binding, we see that foot binding is not necessarily only pain, but there's also beauty, there's also different wrappings of the foot. And I use the work of Dorothy Coe, so that then this demonstrates, you know, that it's not about the antithetical other here, one civilized, one uncivilized. The one-child policy had been seen as negatively by students. And instead, it can be something that international students explain as positively impacting women because families realize the value of daughters. This is only in cities, of course, and not in the countryside. So the characters here, again, demonstrate the nuances: alone, single, given birth, children. And then finally, after the one-child policy, we discuss the concept of leftover women. So this was a concept that was actually negative and introduced by the All China Women's Federation, meaning the character means surplus. The new expression refers to unmarried females who are older than 27. So it's supposed to be negative, but in reality, my students, my international students, talk about how the women are now more educated, they have higher salaries, and are more picky when choosing men. So all of these are concepts that, if we examine more closely and use language, can allow international students to be the teachers of their language, and then allow US-based history students to understand things beyond this idea of the antithetical other that, you know, Professor Islami had talked about in the previous slide. So I'll go on to the next slide, please, Professor Lin. Okay, so again, so the one-child policy begins in 1979 and then ends in 2015. And my international students explain from the perspective of necessity that this is a policy that, that is introduced to help the nation when it comes to resources. They also, in rural areas, discuss, you know, the differences in their experiences, and how sometimes it required that they hide a child or that they pay a fine, and some in cities pay the fine because they had money. So it is actually a very nuanced policy that teaches us more about China than just a draconian control over the population. So also in doing this, it's very important in the history classroom to avoid this antithetical other by examining pronatal policy and antenatal globally, and especially in the United States, so that there's an exchange. So the next slide, please. So one-child policy leads, of course, to selection of children based on gender. And how is that exclusive to China? Well, it's not. So we want to move away from this idea of civilized versus uncivilized by looking at sterilization in the United States and how prevalent it was. I mean, we actually have supported sterilization in the United States. The Supreme Court supported it in 1927. And so we see it prevalent with eugenics and selection of who should reproduce based on race. So when students learn about forced sterilization and the impact of this on the United States and on Latinos and Native people and people of color in general, then they better understand the concept of the one-child policy. And instead of saying this is civilized and we're civilized and China is uncivilized. So next slide, please. Okay, foot binding, as I had mentioned previously, has been the topic of Western missionary writings. And as we know, it's about wrapping the foot. Dorothy Ko, who is a scholar of women in China, she went against this historiography by explaining that it's actually about beauty. And that is what comes through in the logograms as well. So the bound foot is, sometimes the toe is broken, sometimes, you know, it is severe, and then other times it's the foot is casually bound and is not painful. If we compare it, as we did with sterilization and the one-child policy, to things done in the United States, we can see that the corset also was about beauty, and that it too had its components of damage to the organs, the digestive organs. So again, we're using language and dialogue with students to correct this idea of the antithetical other, and really looking at the nuances in history through using language as an essential component and allowing international students to be teachers. So next slide, please. Okay, now, as a result of all of this, the emphasis on the logogram, the presentations of international students explaining the logograms and their parents' experiences, and then we had interviews between the US-based students and the international students, one student summarized what all students experience. And this is a US-based student. So I'm trying to argue that, you know, this helps US-based students and it helps international students. Integrating the classroom helps everybody. And then as Professor Graham said, you know, it prepares them for a global world where they will be talking about their concepts and sharing, and we need more communication. So this is my student's reflection. This is the antithetical other. She said, when my brother was in 2nd grade and I was in 4th grade, my brother's teacher adopted 2 little girls, and my mother told me that girls weren't wanted in China because parents wanted boys, and parents would kill their infant daughters so that they could have a boy. Learning from international students, she said, daughters are actually really loved and highly respected more than they had ever been in Chinese history as a result of the one-child policy. She also learned about foot binding, having a different character. Daughters are empowered now as a result of one-child policy, given a good education, and able to get a good career where they will be financially independent. So this is earth-shattering. So I had a great experience, and I appreciate that Professor Lin approached me. Thank you. About integrating my classroom. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Professor Aslami is back, so we're going to turn over her session. So, Professor Aslami,
Yes.
is this a slide you want me to start with?
Yeah, I think if you go one slide before this one, and I will try to go fast.
Okay, this one?
Yes, and if for some reason, you know, we are disconnected, just please go ahead because my internet connection doesn't seem to be stable here right now. So basically, I was telling you that about the activities I use in order to use multiple resources in one of my content classes, intercultural communication. One of the activities is that I ask the students themselves to translate some of the key concepts or abstract definitions about intercultural communication competence to different languages. For example, this is Arabic. And then I used these as posters in the class. So we have English version, Arabic version, Urdu version, and some other languages in order to show to students that their understanding would be scaffolded in AMI classrooms if they have these translations. And of course, translanguaging is more dynamic than we see here. It's not such a division between Arabic and English. But for a starter, in order to let the students know that different linguistic resources are appreciated and multilingual literacy and awareness gets developed, multiculturalism gets developed, this is one of the things I use. So if you go to the next one, please. This is another example. So next one, please. And again, this is another language that we use. So all the languages that we had in the classroom, Urdu, Hindi, and languages that were available in order to celebrate all this linguistic diversity and in order to present as difficult aspects in intercultural communication, like psychological adjustment or personality strength. These are some of the activities. And if we go to the next one, because I like to have time to go. So another use of translanguaging and multiple resources is in relation to key terms. And keep in mind that sometimes code mixing, code switching, use of L1 and translanguaging are used kind of in a confusing manner. To me, translanguaging is more dynamic and fluid than we are presenting here. And I will show you some other fluid examples. But for a start, in order to scaffold and celebrate the linguistic diversities that you have in your classrooms, and to scaffold the students' understanding, because the students are learning the content in another language. So you are basically using an inclusive approach and celebrating multilingualism, and especially using key terminology in order to promote understanding in both languages and maintain all the different languages. Next slide, please. Again, next slide. These are key terms. So in order to show that how dynamic this can be, this translanguaging, in my first slide that we didn't show, I provided an example of my own son when he was growing up. And he said, Mom, Meisam is aziyating me, which means Meisam is bothering me. Why? In such a fluid and dynamic matter and style, he was using aziyating, which is the root from Persian, and using the suffix from English shows that kind of underlying common underlying work that we have for bilingualism, that for a very highly fluent child to use all the structure in English and suddenly bring a verb from Persian and add ing based on the structural qualities of English, this is a very complex and abstract and complicated and creative process. To me, I think it has affective factors because affectively maybe aziyating shows the intensity of his feelings more. Of course, the translingual users should be interviewed to know the reason. And then I said in response, Meisam dobare, even though I could say again, but why do I use Persian all of a sudden? It's because, and it's dynamic. It's not necessarily that I decide this is how I'm going to use it. Again, it's the feeling and the intensity and the emotions and the identity and sense of belonging that creates in the family. Or I was noticing, to give you another example, I have grandchildren, and during this COVID crisis, I have been helping with their Zoom meeting and homeschooling and all that. And I realized that when I want to really show my emotion that I love them, I say "Qurbunet beram," which is in Persian, and everything else is in English. And now they have developed and understand. And then I say, do you know what "Qurbunet beram" means? And they say, yes, it means I love you. I said, no, it means much more than I love you, because I love you doesn't capture that feeling and emotion that I want to convey can be conveyed through the other language. So these are some of the examples from my own personal experience. But if you look at this example that I have taken from Adrian Blackledge, says there is Romana singing along to music, rock your baby, rock your baby, rock your baby, rock your baby, tumhare bina, without you, China aye, there is no peace, and rock your baby. So you can see suddenly get mixed and mingles in the language in order to show emotion or maybe affection. And then I have another example, because my internet connection is not stable, there is Aleha, Romana, come on, I'm going, Amma, mother, Salam alaikum, goodbye. Oma is being used instead of mom. Again, there are, as I said, these solidarity rhythms and this dynamic and fluid use of languages. And then she says, Salam alaikum, Abba, or Abba, Zariyam Ami, I'm going. So why all of a sudden, for a fluent bilingual or multilingual, we switch back and forth between these languages? So if we go to the next slide, I think I have one more to share. So during this COVID crisis, it's important to know that communication and communicating appropriately and in a culturally responsive with ethics of care to our audience, to these immigrants, multilingual speakers, is highly important. How to communicate to children is not just translating. Translating should be culturally responsive. So I have to know what kind of cultural concepts and values to use when I want to communicate about this virus, for example. And one of the textbooks that for children, there is no monster outside, it's a virus, has been created by Texas A&M University Center for Research and Development, and I have the link down there. The book is available right now in Spanish and English. Very soon, the Persian and all the versions are coming out. So please check the website, get a copy of the book and share it with your children or other children that you have in your classes and get exposed to. Thank you so much for listening, and I do apologize for the internet connection problems.
Thank you, Professor Aslami. Now we will continue with Professor Catherine Richards. Sorry. Okay. Professor Richards?
Hi, this is Zainab. Actually, if you don't mind, I will start off by talking in our presentation, and then I'll pass it off to Dr. Richards.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Zainab Harkness from the University of North Alabama. I am part of an intensive English program, now renamed Academic English Program. It is a pathway program for international students. So throughout our experience in IEP programs, we often find that our international students tend to either congregate together with their one common language group, and they have some apprehension about, being part of the general campus community. In my department, we are always looking for ways to integrate students into the general campus community, but also have our domestic American students interact with our international students to create more of a cultural sharing environment. So when Dr. Richards approached me with this idea of partnering ESL learners with students in her class, I really jumped at the opportunity because I thought this would be a really interesting way to see how learners gain more confidence communicating with their peers, but also kind of be pushed into a more of a cultural sharing, more of an open communication activity. So during this study, we paired our ESL learners with first year composition students who were in Dr. Richards' class. And we set up these groups of students, pairs or groups, and we provided them with certain topics that they could discuss. The main expectation for my students was that they attend these language partner meetings and just keep a reflective journal of the things that they were discussing and of their kind of communication experience. So I'll let Dr. Richards talk a little bit about students in her class.
So hi, my name is Dr. Kathleen Richards, and I do teach first year composition classes here at the University of North Alabama. We came up with the idea that there needed to be more diversity and inclusion, of course, at the university. So all of the students here at the University of North Alabama are, I shouldn't say all of them, but generally they're regional students. So they're from the southern region of the United States. And very few of them have opportunities to actually find out about people from other cultures, people who speak other languages. So this was a great opportunity for me to incorporate this language partner program with ESL students. And my American students absolutely loved it. They were supposed to meet for 8 weeks, 1 hour per week. They could go anywhere they wanted to go to meet together. They were supposed to meet for an hour. Sometimes the more that they became comfortable with one another, they met longer than that. It gave a very comfortable, or provided a very comfortable environment for ESL students and American students to just talk about anything. I wasn't watching over them, and Professor Harkness was not watching over them. We just let the students go and explore the local community. We have a beautiful downtown community, so they went there together. They went all over campus together, and they just talked about whatever they felt comfortable talking about. It was also a wonderful experience for the students to share language. There's a lot of slang and American terminology, and most of the time not understood by international students, which the American students found out the hard way. So they had the American students had a totally different way of speaking, and had to rethink the way that they spoke to the international students. And also, the American students were very curious about languages and words and meanings in the ESL students' countries. So there was that translanguage, or I guess sharing of language and knowledge of one another that worked just really well with these groups. All the students learned, the international students or ESL students, as well as the American students, they became more aware of global awareness. They came so much more aware of acceptance of cultural values. Some of my American students did not understand why the Japanese students did not have any particular religions. That shocked them because in this region, Christianity dominates. So they were curious about that, and it left them opportunities to ask questions. Language acquisition, it really helped the ESL students become a little more confident with speaking with other American students. They weren't so shy. And the ESL students, of course, gained a better insight into American culture, because most of the American students would say, hey, let's go off campus. Let's go to an ice cream parlor, or let's go out to eat, or let's drive around and check out the scenery. So that gave them opportunities that they may not have had. It gave the ESL students opportunities they may not have had if they had just, stayed on campus with their groups of similar language speaking students. So it worked out really well. Can we go to the next slide, Professor Lin? Okay. So here are some places where they constructed that third space. And what I mean by third space is it's a space where the students made themselves where they felt comfortable to talk to one another and to share their stories and to share information about themselves. The first picture you see, we have actually more than one group of language partners there that decided to meet at a local ice cream parlor, which they frequently visited. In this picture in the middle, there's a young American student who took his international student, his language learner, to church with him, because the student, the ESL student, was very curious about the American students' church. And to the far right, you see a picture of the students together. They love to play pool and ping pong, so they frequented the game room here on campus. And as they were playing, of course, communications and conversations just ensued from there. Okay, Professor Lin, would you go to the next slide, please? Thanks. So here's what we asked some of the international students. This isn't all of them. This is just a few responses. But you'll notice that most of these responses were, from the ESL students, I started to feel more comfortable speaking, because of course ESL students, it's one of the reasons why they want to stay with speaking students, the Chinese students and the Japanese students and the Arabic students. They all want to stay together because they feel so much more comfortable speaking to one another. But this gave them the opportunity to break through that barrier and not be so, I guess, embarrassed or shy about broken English. You know, they're not so perfect English, which they learned was okay because even American students don't speak perfect English, especially in the South. And they learned this and they felt so much more comfortable about the situations that they were in. They even kept in touch with their American students even after this was over, and met at different times and met more than they were supposed to for that 1 hour. So it was really nice that this program kind of broke these students out of their shell and made them feel a little more confident to communicate with other American students on campus. Professor Lynn, the next slide.
And if I may, Dr. Richards, interject there. For most of the students, I think that the scaffolding at the beginning of the project really helped, because that helped them kind of overcome their initial, now speak with American students, that fear of not speaking proper English, or not knowing what to do. So after we went through those first couple of weeks, they felt more comfortable. And in language acquisition, it's important to note that students, the language learners who participated in this exercise throughout, showed better language competency at the end of that semester. The other, I think, important thing is that sense of belonging and community that the students, I know you will talk about this too, is that one of the students, for instance, continued and pursued a position in student government on university campus. So, I mean, there was a lot of encouragement for language learners, and as that communication moved forward, they were able to build more confidence to take part in more active roles on campus as well.
So just to sum up, the American students, from my end, they learned so much about culture, traditions, religions, the customs. They created their own third culture space with the international students, where they were allowed to do what they needed to do. With this project, of course, there were a few hurdles. Sometimes getting some students to meet and be on time for meetings with other students, or communicating through texting regarding where to meet. But those weren't major hurdles. This was a great project, as we got a lot of positive feedback from the students, and we'll probably do this again. And we would suggest that, maybe some of you try it. If you don't have, of course, internationally, you may want to try it online. Through Zoom, where you find another school from the United States or from London or Australia and so forth, where they speak English, and have those students meet virtually. I've read studies where that's been done, and it's been done well, and students seem to really like that, given the opportunity to share online. So thank you so much for listening today. Thank you for your attendance.
Thank you. I want to thank all the invited speakers for sharing their experiences engaging language diversity in their classroom. As many of you have commented in the comment box, that a variety of languages can really enrich our learning experiences in the classroom. Now we still have some time left, so we would like to open to questions and comments. I'd like to share George's comment, he talked about teachers can work with students around the world. This also gives a teacher opportunity to expose different cultures, languages, and other online education. Yes, I think all the invited speaker kind of position themselves as a learner in the classroom, and so the reverse the classroom dynamic, and encourage the student to share their cultural experiences. And Arena also commented, multiculturalism allow foreign students as well as native-born speakers to learn from each other and building linguistic community. Yes, I like this concept of linguistic community.
May I have a question?
Yes.
Yeah, my name is Qusay. I work in the University of Tabuk in Saudi Arabia. So I just read the statement or a fact that many researchers proved that it's better to teach the kids in their early childhood in their native language. So it's better for them to master their language at the beginning. Then we start with them a second language. To what extent do you agree with this statement?
Are there any speaker would like to address to the?
I can address that question, Kusai. Thank you, Al-Shwaiter. Mr. Al-Shwaiter, is that right?
Yeah,
Thank
exactly.
Yeah, there are different opinions as far as research is concerned. Some researchers believe that it's very important for children to have a solid foundation of their first language before you start introducing their second language to them. But some other researchers believe in simultaneous, not sequential, but simultaneous bilingualism. If the child is exposed to both languages in kind of somewhat equal amount and lives in a language-rich environment with all the multiple languages, and that there is no impeding factor as far as language development or child's mental, psychological, cognitive issues. So there are different opinions. If you have a minority language child going to a majority language school, it's definitely important to have the foundation in the first language so that the first language is solidified before you introduce the second language, because as some researchers have mentioned, with those minority children who come maybe from less linguistic rich environment, if that solid foundation is not formed yet, then we may result in what some people call semi-bilingualism. But there are different opinions about this, and it depends on a lot of different surrounding factors. We are dealing with a very complex phenomena in order to be able to answer that question straightforward as yes or no.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I would also like to concur Professor Salami's comment that right now there are a lot of theorizing about the mother tongue bilingualism. That would be another interesting topic for a different webinar. The theorizing of bilingual as a linear. We wonder how much it will fit into our many learners' cultural experiences. It's a question that worth studying, and we will see if we can have another webinar on this topic. Thank you. Due to the constraint of time, we are not able to take another questions, but let's stay in touch. And please join us join our Facebook page and or our Twitter to continue to build this conversation. And I also want to give you a preview of our upcoming webinar events. Our August webinar is entitled "Do Black Lives Matter in Bilingual Language?" Professor Nelson Flores. So we look forward to seeing you in our next webinar event. Again, thank you everyone out there for being able to take your time to join us today. We thank you and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you everyone. Okay, have a good day.
Thank you.